I found him in the middle of a cold, silent night, guarding an abandoned crib, his eyes sharp, yet filled with the exhaustion of a creature who had given everything to protect. No one had ever expected him to be there, alone, in the middle of nowhere. But he was. A stray, a dog with no name, no home, only a promise to defend what was left behind. His fur was matted, his body trembling from the harsh winds that swept across the barren land, but his stance was unwavering. There, in the shadow of an old, forgotten building, he stood guard. Not for food, not for warmth, but for something far more important. For a crib, for something, or someone, he had to protect. James Parker, a Marine, had been through many battlefields, but none as strange as this one. As he approached the abandoned site, his mind was clouded with memories of war, the loss of friends, and the empty silence that followed. But then, he heard it. A faint growl, a low warning, and suddenly, a pair of amber eyes locked onto his. The dog didn't move. It didn't bark or retreat. It just watched him, waiting. James stepped forward slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, just in case. But he wasn't prepared for what he saw next. The dog, a German shepherd, stood at the edge of the crib, his body tense but unwavering. Something in the Marine's chest tightened. The dog wasn't just standing there, it was guarding something. James knelt, his instincts telling him there was more to this than met the eye. He saw the crib, empty, but the sight of it triggered something deep within him. The dog wasn't just a stray. He was part of a larger story, one James couldn't yet see. He reached out cautiously, speaking softly, trying to gain the dog's trust. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dog's eyes softened, but he didn't move. It was as if he knew something James didn't. Something about this crib, something about the bond they shared. James could feel the weight of the moment, the silence surrounding them both, heavy with unanswered questions. He had seen loyalty before, but this was different. It wasn't just loyalty, it was sacrifice. The dog wasn't just guarding a crib. He was guarding something deeper. James felt a sudden wave of clarity. This wasn't a coincidence. There was a reason this dog was here. There was a reason he had found him. And in that moment, as he crouched down and extended his hand, he realized that this was no longer about a Marine saving a stray. This was about something far bigger, a story of redemption, of life after loss, and the miracles that could still happen when all seemed lost. James took a slow breath, the air cold against his face as he watched the stray dog. There was something deeply unsettling about the moment, the quiet, the stillness, the way the dog refused to leave its post. The Marine had seen loyalty before, but not like this. Not in a place like this, where the abandoned crib stood, empty and forgotten. He took another step forward, cautiously, his eyes scanning the surroundings. His mind raced with the possibilities, with the questions he couldn't yet answer. Who had left the crib here? And why was this dog, this German shepherd, so determined to protect it? The dog growled low, its body tense as James came closer, but he didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of the dog's gaze, the silent understanding between them. The Marine knelt down, his movements slow, deliberate, offering his hand in peace. "Easy, boy," he said softly, his voice low and calm. The dog's amber eyes softened for a moment, but it didn't move. James knew better than to push. He sat back on his heels, waiting, watching. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. He glanced at the crib again, a hollow, forgotten thing, standing in the middle of nowhere. And then he realized, this wasn't just a random encounter. This dog wasn't just guarding an abandoned crib. He was guarding something far deeper. The dog's loyalty wasn't just to an object, it was to a promise. James stood up, looking around the area. The forest surrounding them was eerily quiet, the wind whispering through the trees. He had seen many things in his years of service. Wars, destruction, chaos, but nothing like this. This wasn't about fighting, about survival, or even about redemption. This was about trust, about something pure that had yet to be broken. James took a step back, his hand still extended toward the dog, waiting for the right moment. The dog watched him, unwavering, as if asking him to understand. Slowly, cautiously, James took out his phone and called for backup. He didn't know why he felt this pull toward this strange place, this strange dog, but he couldn't ignore it. He had to find out why this moment felt so significant. As he waited for the team to arrive, he sat down beside the crib, his eyes on the dog. There was a bond here, an invisible thread that tied them together, and he could feel it. The dog, though cautious, had shown no signs of aggression. It was simply protecting. But what was it protecting? And who had left this crib behind, so carefully placed in the middle of nowhere? The team would be here soon. But James couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay not in the crib or the dog, but in the moments that had led him here. Something told him that the story wasn't just about a rescue. It was about something deeper, something that connected them all in ways he couldn't yet understand. As James waited for the backup to arrive, the wind began to pick up, stirring the leaves and casting long shadows across the barren land. The dog, still standing watch over the abandoned crib, never took its eyes off him. It was as if it was waiting for something, waiting for James to understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary mission. There was something about this place, this moment, that felt important. The Marine ran a hand through his short, weathered hair, his mind racing. What was it about this dog? What was it guarding? And why was it here in this desolate place, far from any town or human life? The dog's stance didn't change. It was as resolute as the surrounding wilderness. James sighed, feeling a deep sense of responsibility weighing on him. He had been trained for war, for combat, but this was different. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do, but he knew he couldn't just leave. He had to figure it out. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. The team was on their way. James stood up and paced around the area, his boots crunching the dried grass beneath him. He glanced at the dog, still unmoving, guarding the crib. The dog's fur was matted and dirty, but its eyes held a strange intensity, a sharpness that made James pause. It wasn't just a stray, it was more than that. He thought about his own experiences, about the years he had spent in the military. He had seen things, done things, that haunted him, but none of it felt like this. None of it felt like this bond that was forming between him and the dog. As he waited, his thoughts drifted back to the crib. It was an odd sight in the middle of nowhere, an abandoned crib, yet someone had placed it here with purpose. He couldn't explain it, but something about it seemed significant, as if it were a symbol of hope or loss. James couldn't help but feel a connection to it, as if it held the key to understanding what had drawn him here. His fingers brushed against the handle of his knife, a reflex born from years of service. He wasn't sure why he felt so strongly about this situation, but he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away without knowing the full story. The team would be here soon, but for now, all he had was the dog and the crib. Slowly, James walked back to the crib and knelt beside it. He studied it closely, his fingers tracing the edges of the wooden slats. It was weathered, worn down by time, but it was sturdy. He couldn't help but think about the child who might have once been placed in it. Had they left in a hurry? Had they abandoned it out of necessity, or had something else forced them to leave? He shook his head, trying to focus. He wasn't here to dwell on what was gone. He was here to find out what was left. The dog, still guarding the crib, let out a low growl. James looked at it, his eyes meeting the dog's amber gaze. It was as if the dog was telling him to pay attention, to look beyond the surface. As the wind howled through the trees, James stood up slowly, determination setting in. He wasn't going to leave without answers. Whatever was happening here, he would uncover it. He had to, and he wasn't going to let the dog face it alone. As James stood by the crib, the air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier. He could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure of something about to unfold. The dog, still standing vigil by the abandoned crib, was watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. James couldn't explain why, but he felt as if the dog was waiting for him to make the next move. The team had not arrived yet, and the silence between them felt almost sacred. It was as though the dog was guarding more than just a forgotten crib. It was guarding a secret, something important, something James wasn't yet meant to understand. The low growl from the dog broke the silence again, and James felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The dog's body tensed, its eyes narrowing. James looked around instinctively, his hand reaching for his phone again to check for any sign of his team. But there was nothing. No response. The forest around him stood still, as though waiting. His eyes flicked back to the dog, who was now pacing slowly, its head turning slightly towards him as if inviting him to follow. James hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that leaving wasn't an option. The dog had brought him here for a reason, and he felt a strange pull to uncover it. Slowly, cautiously, he followed the dog as it moved deeper into the woods, its paws barely making a sound on the damp ground. James felt a quiet connection to the creature, a bond that wasn't formed by words, but by something far deeper. The dog had been through something, and James had a feeling it wasn't just guarding an abandoned crib. It was leading him somewhere. The trees towered above them, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves beneath their feet. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close in around them. James could feel his heart racing, but he didn't stop. There was something about the dog's movements, its quiet strength, that pushed him forward. He didn't know why he felt this way, why he felt as if he was being drawn into something far bigger than himself, but he couldn't turn back. The dog led him to a clearing, where the moonlight broke through the canopy above, casting long shadows on the ground. In the center of the clearing, James saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, lying in the middle of the forest, was a small, weathered box. It was old, covered in dirt and leaves, but something about it seemed significant. The dog stopped in front of the box and looked back at James. It was as if the dog was telling him that this was the moment. James bent down slowly, his fingers brushing against the surface of the box. It felt cold, its edges rough with age, but there was a strange warmth inside it, like it had been waiting for him. With a deep breath, James opened the box, and inside, he found something that would change everything. A photograph. Faded, worn, but still intact. It showed a woman holding a baby, smiling, the sunlight catching in their hair. And in the background, standing tall, was the very same German Shepherd. It was the same dog. James's heart pounded in his chest. This was no coincidence. The dog had been protecting something much more than just an abandoned crib. It had been guarding a memory. A memory that now, somehow, he was a part of. James's hands trembled as he held the photograph, the edges worn and frayed, as if it had been carried through years of hardship. The face of the woman was familiar, but not in a way he could place. Her smile was warm, and the baby she cradled in her arms looked content, safe in her embrace. But it was the dog in the background that sent a chill down his spine. It was the same German Shepherd, the same dog that had led him here, the one guarding the crib. The dog in the photograph was standing tall and proud, its gaze focused and alert, much like it had been moments ago when it looked at James. He slowly stood up, holding the photo close to his chest, his thoughts racing. How could this be? Why was this dog guarding this memory? The forest around him seemed to close in, the shadows of the trees stretching long and dark as the night deepened. He could feel the weight of the moment settling on him, the sense that something had shifted. The dog had brought him here, not just to a physical place, but to a memory, one that connected him to something he couldn't yet fully understand. The dog, still standing motionless at the edge of the clearing, turned its head towards him, its amber eyes watching him with a strange intensity. James took a deep breath and walked back toward the dog, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to know more. He couldn't walk away now. As he neared the dog, it didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle. It simply stood there, watching him. The silence was heavy, but there was a calmness in it, an unspoken understanding. James crouched down, placing the photograph gently on the ground between them. The dog's eyes flickered to the image, and then back to James. It was as if the dog was waiting for him to make the connection. Slowly, James reached out and touched the dog's fur, the warmth of the animal grounding him, calming the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. "What is it you want me to see?" he whispered, though he didn't expect an answer. The dog remained still, but something shifted in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. James stood up and turned his attention back to the photograph. His mind was piecing together fragments, the unspoken connection between the crib, the dog, and the people in the picture. He wasn't sure what it all meant, but something told him that this was just the beginning. The photograph had to be a clue, a piece of a larger puzzle. The dog had been protecting the crib, protecting the memory, and now it had led James to this moment. But why? What had happened to the woman and the child in the photo? Why had they left the crib behind? And why had the dog stayed, guarding it for all these years? The questions swirled in his mind, but as he looked down at the dog, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The dog wasn't just a protector, it was a guide. The answers would come, but for now, James knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave this place without understanding the full story. The dog had chosen him for a reason, and together, they would uncover the truth. James stood in the clearing, the photograph still gripped in his hand, his thoughts swirling like the wind around him. The dog remained motionless, unwavering, as if waiting for something. Something he still didn't fully understand. He glanced down at the photograph again. The woman in the picture had a gentle smile, a warmth that contrasted with the cold of the night. The baby in her arms looked peaceful, unaware of the world around it. And then there was the dog, standing in the background, guarding them even then. He could feel the weight of the dog's gaze on him, as if urging him to connect the dots, to understand what had led him here. But the answers were elusive. The crib, the photograph, the dog, it was all part of a bigger story, one that had been waiting for years to be uncovered. The team still hadn't arrived, and James felt the isolation of the place settle deeper into his bones. The forest around him was vast, endless, and he was standing on the edge of something much larger than he had imagined. He looked at the dog again, its amber eyes filled with a quiet wisdom, as though it had seen things that James could not yet comprehend. Slowly, the dog turned and began to walk away, its steps deliberate, calm. James followed instinctively, feeling a pull deep within him. He wasn't sure why, but he knew he had to follow. The dog led him further into the forest, its path winding through the trees. James' boots crunched softly against the earth, the silence surrounding them punctuated only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. They moved deeper into the woods, the night growing darker around them. The dog never looked back, but James could feel its presence, guiding him towards something unknown. As they walked, the image of the photograph kept flashing in his mind. The woman, the baby, the dog. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were all connected, that this moment, this strange encounter in the woods, was somehow meant to happen. The air grew colder as they reached the edge of the woods, and James could see the faint outline of something in the distance. The dog stopped, its body tensing, its ears pricked. James felt his pulse quicken. What was it? What was the dog protecting now? As they approached, the shape became clearer, a small shack, worn and weathered by time, standing alone in the clearing. The dog stood in front of it, its eyes fixed on James, as if waiting for him to make the next move. James hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing on him. The shack seemed out of place, as though it had been abandoned long ago. But there was something about it that felt important. The dog had led him here for a reason, and he knew it wasn't by chance. With a deep breath, James stepped forward, his hand still gripping the photograph. As he reached the door of the shack, the dog barked once, low and firm, as if to warn him. But there was no fear in its eyes, only a quiet sense of duty. James opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air was musty, the smell of old wood and dust filling his senses. In the dim light, he could make out the faint outline of a table, a few old chairs, and something small in the corner, another crib. This one was different, though. It wasn't abandoned. It was well kept, the sheets neatly arranged, as if someone had cared for it. James felt a chill run down his spine. This was the place the dog had been protecting. The crib wasn't empty. It was filled with something, someone. As he stepped closer, he could see the faint outline of a baby blanket, the edges frayed with age. He knelt down, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find. But this was not what he had imagined. The crib held more than just memories. It held a story. And James knew, deep down, that the answers he had been searching for were within reach. James knelt beside the crib, the air thick with a silence that felt almost sacred. The small, weathered shack seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to understand. The blanket in the crib was old, its edges frayed from years of wear, yet it was neatly arranged, almost as though someone had been here recently, taking care to leave everything in place. The dim light filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows across the room. James leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he reached out to touch the edge of the blanket. His fingers brushed against the fabric, and for a moment, he couldn't move. It was as if the room itself had frozen in time, holding onto something that James could not yet fully grasp. The dog stood quietly at the entrance, its amber eyes fixed on him, watching without a sound. James glanced up at the dog, a strange sense of knowing passing between them. This wasn't just a crib, it was a connection to the past, to a story that had been buried for far too long. He looked back at the crib, his breath catching in his throat. There, beneath the blanket, was a small, tattered journal. It was almost hidden, as though someone had placed it there with care, but had hoped it would remain undisturbed. James's hands shook slightly as he picked up the journal, its cover worn from age, the leather cracked and faded. The weight of it in his hands felt heavy with significance, and he knew without a doubt that this was the key to understanding everything. He opened the journal slowly, the pages stiff and yellowed with time. The handwriting inside was delicate, neat, almost like a letter to someone long forgotten. James couldn't help but feel like he was intruding on something personal, something that had been waiting for the right person to discover it. As he read, the words began to make sense. The journal told a story of loss and love, of a woman who had once lived here, a woman who had loved the dog and the child she had once held. The dog, the very same one standing in front of James, had been her protector, her guardian, even before the crib had been abandoned. The journal spoke of a promise made between the woman and the dog, one that had been passed down, never broken. The dog had stayed, guarding the crib, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. James could feel the weight of the promise in the pages, a promise of loyalty, of protection, and of something deeper that connected them all. He closed the journal gently, his thoughts swirling. The dog had led him here for a reason. It had guarded not just a crib, but a legacy, a memory that had been kept alive by the dog's unwavering loyalty. The woman had left, but the bond between her and the dog had never faded. And now, James was a part of that story, a part of the promise that had been made long ago. He looked up at the dog, its eyes filled with understanding. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a quiet knowing. James stood up slowly, the journal pressed firmly against his chest. The answers were finally within reach, but there was more to uncover. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving until he understood the full story. The dog had chosen him, and now, together, they would uncover the rest. James stood there in the dimly lit shack, holding the journal close to his chest, his thoughts racing. The dog, still silent and watchful, stood in the corner of the room, its amber eyes never leaving him. It was as if the dog knew that the moment of revelation had come, that everything they had been guarding was now in his hands. James looked around the room, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The photograph, the crib, the journal, each piece of the puzzle had led him here, and yet, there was still so much he didn't understand. He glanced back down at the journal, the words still fresh in his mind. The woman had written about her life, about her bond with the dog, and the promise they had made to each other. But what had happened to her? Why had she left everything behind? And why had the dog stayed? The questions swirled in his mind as he walked to the small window of the shack, looking out into the night. The forest stretched endlessly before him, the dark trees standing like silent sentinels, their shadows long and foreboding. He had come here looking for answers, and now, he was more uncertain than ever. The dog had led him to this place, but why? What was the connection between the woman in the photograph and the dog? As he stood there, the wind picking up outside, he realized something. The answers he was seeking weren't just about the past. They were about the present, about the bond that had formed between him and the dog. The dog had chosen him for a reason, just as it had chosen to stay by the crib for all those years. It wasn't just about protecting a memory, it was about protecting something that was still very much alive. He felt a deep sense of responsibility wash over him. The dog wasn't just a guardian of the past. It was a protector of something that was still waiting to be discovered. Slowly, he turned back toward the dog, his eyes meeting its gaze. There was no fear in its eyes, only a quiet understanding, as if it knew the journey they had begun together was far from over. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. He had come here to find the truth, and now, the truth was beginning to reveal itself. The dog was more than just a stray. It was a link between two worlds, two lives, one that had been lost and one that was still waiting to be found. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, pressing him toward something greater. The dog walked toward him, its steps slow and deliberate, as if inviting him to follow. James didn't hesitate. He knew that whatever was left to uncover, whatever truths remained, he would face them together with the dog. As he followed the dog outside, the chill of the night air hit him, but it didn't matter. The answers were out there, waiting for him to find them. And he would, with the dog by his side, guiding him toward the truth that had been hidden for so long. James followed the dog through the dense forest, the moonlight barely filtering through the thick canopy above. The dog's steady, purposeful steps were a constant, reassuring presence in the silence of the night. James's mind raced as he walked, the weight of the journal still heavy in his hands. The woman's words echoed in his mind, but they were incomplete, fragmented. He needed more. He needed to understand why this had been hidden for so long. As they moved deeper into the woods, James couldn't help but feel as though the forest itself was alive, watching them. The trees loomed over them like ancient guardians, and the path they walked seemed to stretch on endlessly, as though it had no end. The dog led him with unerring focus, its amber eyes never straying from the path ahead. James felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as if the dog had known exactly where to go all along. It wasn't just a journey through the woods. It was a journey through time, through memories that had been buried long ago. He glanced down at the dog again. There was something almost human in its movements, in the way it carried itself, with a quiet dignity, a strength that seemed to go beyond its role as a protector. This dog wasn't just guarding a crib or a memory. It was guarding something much more profound, something that had been waiting for the right moment to be discovered. After what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing. In the center, hidden beneath a veil of overgrown vines, was a stone structure, old and weathered by time. The dog stopped at the edge of the clearing, its posture still alert, watching the structure intently. James felt his heart quicken. This was it. This was what the dog had been leading him to. As he approached, he noticed the stone was carved with intricate patterns, symbols he couldn't recognize but felt drawn to. The air around them seemed to shift, as though the very earth beneath their feet was holding its breath. James knelt down, placing the journal on the stone, and ran his fingers over the carvings. They were old, ancient, and yet somehow familiar. It was as though the very history of the forest, of the land, was embedded in these stones. He had come here looking for answers, but now, standing in front of this mysterious structure, he realized that the answers would not come easily. He wasn't just uncovering a hidden past. He was stepping into a new chapter, a new story that had yet to unfold. The dog stood beside him, still watching, its eyes steady. It had brought him this far, and now, it was up to him to discover the rest. James stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on the structure. He could feel the weight of the moment, the enormity of what lay ahead. This was more than just a rescue. It was a journey, a connection to something greater, something that transcended time. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. The dog had shown him the way, and now, it was time to uncover the truth. He took a deep breath, turned toward the stone structure, and stepped forward, ready to face whatever awaited him. The dog followed closely, its presence a silent reassurance that he was not alone in this journey. As James stepped closer to the stone structure, the air seemed to thicken, the tension almost palpable. The dog, ever vigilant, remained by his side, its amber eyes scanning the surroundings with the kind of focus that only a creature who had been through much could possess. James could feel his pulse quicken as he approached the base of the structure, the carved symbols on the stone now seeming more significant, more alive. It was as though the patterns were speaking to him, urging him to understand something deeper, something that had been hidden for so long. His hand hovered over the stone, trembling slightly as he traced one of the symbols, a pattern that seemed to repeat itself in a way that felt both ancient and familiar. His mind raced with thoughts of what this could mean. Was this part of the story that the dog had been guarding all along? What was the connection between this place and the crib, the woman in the photograph, the dog itself? The air around him grew colder, the stillness of the night now broken only by the sound of his breath. As he traced the symbol, he felt a sudden warmth radiate from the stone, as though the energy of the place was awakening in response to his touch. He froze for a moment, unsure of what was happening. The dog stood still, as if waiting for something to happen, its eyes never leaving him. James felt a deep, inexplicable pull, urging him to continue. Slowly, he pressed his palm against the stone. A soft, almost imperceptible vibration passed through the ground beneath his feet, and the sound of something shifting echoed faintly through the air. For a split second, the stone seemed to hum with life, and then, just as quickly, it stopped. James stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. Had he done something? Had he unlocked something? He looked at the dog, whose eyes were now fixed on the stone, as if it knew exactly what had just happened. James took a deep breath and turned back to the structure, his hand still resting on the stone. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something inside him told him this was the moment. He couldn't explain it, but the sense of urgency, of destiny, was undeniable. With a final breath, he pressed harder against the stone. There was a low rumble, and then, with a sound like stone grinding against stone, the ground beneath his feet began to shift. Slowly, a section of the stone wall slid open, revealing a hidden chamber inside. James's breath caught in his throat as he peered into the darkness beyond. It was a space that seemed to stretch on forever, the walls lined with more carvings, more symbols, some familiar, others strange and unknown. The dog stepped forward, its posture relaxed now, as if it had known all along that this moment would come. James followed, his heart racing as he stepped into the chamber, the air cooler and thicker inside. The light from the outside world barely reached this place, but James could still make out the shapes and markings on the walls, the carvings telling a story of their own. As he ventured further, he saw something else. A pedestal stood at the center of the chamber, and atop it, nestled in a bed of dust, was a small wooden box. The box was intricately carved, just like the walls, but it seemed different, as though it held something of immense importance. He stepped closer, his mind racing with questions. What was inside? What was he meant to find here? As his fingers brushed the surface of the box, the dog sat quietly beside him, its gaze steady and knowing. James didn't need to ask. He knew the box was the next piece of the puzzle, the final key to unlocking the mystery that had led him here. He took a deep breath, lifted the lid, and finally, for the first time, he understood the truth. As James lifted the lid of the wooden box, the soft creak of its hinges echoed through the chamber, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Inside, resting delicately on a bed of worn cloth, was an old pendant, its edges etched with intricate patterns that matched the carvings on the stone walls. James reached for it, his fingers trembling as he touched the cold metal. It was heavier than he expected, the weight of it carrying a significance that was impossible to ignore. The pendant seemed to pulse with energy, its surface smooth and ancient, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. James's mind raced. What was this? Why had it been hidden away in this forgotten chamber? He held the pendant in his hand, feeling its weight settle in the pit of his stomach. The dog, still sitting beside him, watched intently, its gaze unwavering. It knew something he didn't. James could feel it. Slowly, he placed the pendant around his neck, the cool metal resting against his skin. As soon as it touched him, something strange happened. The air in the chamber shifted. The carvings on the walls seemed to come alive, glowing faintly with a golden light that had not been there before. The room itself seemed to hum with energy, and for a brief moment, James felt as though he were no longer alone. The dog stood up, its posture now more alert, its eyes locked onto James. The pendant began to warm against his chest, and he felt a surge of memories. Images of the woman from the photograph, the crib, the dog, flood his mind. He saw flashes of their lives, moments that had been long forgotten. He saw the woman, smiling as she held the baby, the dog standing beside them, its gaze protective. Then, the image shifted. He saw the woman leaving, walking away from the crib, leaving behind the dog to guard it. He saw the pain in the dog's eyes as it watched her go. It had stayed behind, guarding the crib, waiting for something or someone. The visions grew more intense, the images moving faster, the emotions overwhelming. James felt a deep sadness, a longing that stretched across time. The dog's loyalty had never wavered. It had stayed, guarding the crib, guarding the memory of the woman who had once loved it. And now, it was here, with him, guiding him toward the truth. As the images faded, James found himself back in the chamber, the pendant still warm against his chest. The room was silent again, but everything had changed. He now understood. The dog had been guarding more than just a crib. It had been guarding the memory of a love that had been lost. A love that was now being passed down, from the woman, to the dog, and finally, to him. The dog had led him here, to uncover the truth, to understand the bond that connected them all. James stood up slowly, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the journey was far from over. But now, with the pendant around his neck, and the dog by his side, he knew that he was ready to continue. Together, they would uncover the rest of the story, and he would finally understand the true meaning of loyalty, love, and the promises that bound them all. James stood still, the pendant now warm against his chest, its presence a constant reminder of the journey that had led him here. The dog, ever faithful, sat by his side, its eyes focused on him with a knowing gaze, as if understanding that they had reached a turning point. The chamber around them was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of energy that still lingered in the air, as though the very walls were holding their breath. James felt a deep sense of connection, not just to the dog, but to the woman from the photograph, to the child, and to the memory they had all shared. The weight of the pendant seemed to pull him towards something beyond the walls of the chamber. He knew he had to continue, to follow the path that had been set before him. The answers were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. As he looked around, he noticed that the symbols on the walls had shifted slightly, as though the room itself had reacted to the pendant's touch. The patterns were now clearer, more defined, and James could feel their meaning resonating within him. They weren't just decorative carvings. They were instructions, a guide to the next part of the journey. He turned to the dog, who stood and began to walk toward the far side of the chamber, its pace slow but purposeful. James followed, his heart beating faster as he moved through the chamber, his eyes scanning the walls for any further clues. The dog led him to a narrow passageway, hidden behind a curtain of vines that had grown over the entrance. The air in the passageway was cool, and the walls seemed to close in around them, creating a sense of intimacy, as though the passage itself was protecting them. The dog moved ahead, its steps confident, as if it had walked this path many times before. James felt an overwhelming sense of trust in the dog. It had guided him this far, and he knew that it would continue to lead him to the truth. As they moved deeper into the passage, the light from outside grew dimmer, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the pendant around his neck. The walls of the passage were lined with more symbols, and James realized that they were telling a story, a history that had been buried beneath layers of time. The passage opened into another room, this one much larger than the last. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and upon it rested a large, ancient book. The dog paused at the entrance, its gaze fixed on the book, its body tense as if sensing the significance of what lay ahead. James approached the pedestal slowly, his heart racing with anticipation. The book was bound in leather, its surface worn and faded, but there was a sense of power about it, as though it held the final key to the mystery. As he reached for the book, the dog stepped forward and nudged his hand with its nose, urging him to be cautious. James hesitated for a moment, then carefully opened the book. The pages were filled with more symbols, but now they were clearer, more legible. The words were a language he didn't understand, but somehow, as his eyes scanned the pages, he felt a deep recognition, as if the words were unlocking something inside him. The dog sat beside him, its eyes never leaving the book. James knew that this was it, the final piece of the puzzle. The story was unfolding before him, and with each turn of the page, the truth became clearer. The woman, the child, the dog, it was all connected, a legacy that had been waiting for him to discover. He continued reading, the weight of the book heavy in his hands, but the knowledge it contained felt even heavier. The dog had led him here, not just to uncover the past, but to embrace the future, to understand the bond that had brought them all together. James closed the book, his mind reeling from the words that had unfolded before him. The dog, ever watchful, remained by his side, its amber eyes locked on him as if understanding the significance of what had just been revealed. The room, once filled with uncertainty, now felt heavy with the weight of truth. The book had told the story, the missing pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The woman in the photograph, the crib, the dog, it was all part of a legacy, a promise that had been passed down through time. James stood still for a moment, absorbing everything. The dog had known. It had guarded this secret for years, waiting for the right person to find it. And now, here he was, standing in the heart of this forgotten place, with the answers finally within his grasp. The pendant around his neck still warmed against his skin, and he felt a deep connection to everything around him. The woman, the dog, the crib. They were all part of a bond that had transcended time, a bond that had led him here. But there was still more to uncover. James turned back to the pedestal, his gaze lingering on the book. He knew the dog had led him to this moment for a reason. This was not just about the past. It was about understanding the future, about honoring the legacy that had been entrusted to him. The dog had been more than a guardian. It had been a guide, a protector, and now, it was his companion on this journey. With a deep breath, James carefully closed the book and placed it back on the pedestal, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He wasn't just walking away with answers. He was walking away with a responsibility, a duty to honor the memory of those who had come before him. The dog stood up and walked toward the entrance of the chamber, its movements slow but purposeful. James followed, his steps steady as he walked behind the dog. The journey had been long, filled with mysteries and revelations, but it wasn't over yet. He had found the truth, but the story was still unfolding. As they left the chamber, James could feel the air shift, the weight of the past lifting as they stepped back into the world. The dog, his loyal companion, walked by his side, its presence a reminder of the bond they shared, a bond that had led them to this point. The forest outside was quiet, the night still and peaceful. James knew that the answers he had found were only the beginning. There was a long road ahead, but with the dog by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. They had uncovered the past, and now it was time to step into the future together.